right, so what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to explain the inquiry process in a little bit of more depth for you guys if you're a little bit confused. So basically, when we start off our little mini units that we have a scenario, and this is your scenario right here. Your scenario says you are an archaeologist who has found artifacts from an ancient society. Your job is to use the artifacts you found to report on the culture of the ancient society. I didn't write it all out there, but you have it on It's Learning if you want to read the whole thing. So, in this scenario, you are an archaeologist who found an artifact, and you have to use that artifact to report on the culture of that society. So let's start off with identify, okay? So when you look in It's Learning, each of these steps are separated out into their own activities. And that's how I want you to submit your information. So for identify, what you're going to be doing is writing focus questions, okay? So by focus question, I mean research questions, okay? So the first thing that you would probably need to know in this scenario is what culture did I find an artifact from? Artifact from. Another focus question for this one would be, what is my artifact? So for identify, you're coming up with research questions like these. You are the one who makes these questions. Eventually you will answer them, but at this point in the identify step, you do not have to answer the question. When you submit on It's Learning, all I want are these things in circles. You can come up with your own focus questions, and the more you have, the better your research will go. So when you submit for identify, all you need to do is submit your research questions. Those two are just examples that I came up with, okay? So once you're done with that, you move on to explore. So explore is your research part. So this is where you go and you try to find your answers. So you take your questions and you think about them and then you start to research them. So if this was one of my focus questions, what culture did I find an artifact from? What culture am I focusing on? I would think about it and be like, well, what am I interested in? In my case, if I wanted to do this, I would probably pick ancient Egypt because it's really interesting to me. For you, you can pick any culture you want. You could even pretend that you're a future archaeologist finding something from today. So in my case, I'm picking ancient Egypt. So I would start to research ancient Egypt. That would lead me to find out my next question, what is my artifact? So just for example, let's say that I'm exploring ancient Egypt and I found a mummy. That is going to be the artifact that I found in my focus question, and I'm going to use it to report on the culture of the society, okay? So for the research part on It's Learning, I want you to submit the information that you have found on websites. So if for research, if I was researching mummies, I would put my link when I submit it. Pretend that's your text box on It's Learning. I would write something about, I found mummies here. And then I would paste in the link. Blah, whatever the link is. Okay? So this is what I would be submitting. If you have ever written a research paper of any kind, this is kind of like a bibliography. This is where I want you to put your research and tell me what you found. I don't want just a list of links and no information about them. I want to know what you found at each link. And it's okay if it's just a very short sentence. I just want to know what you found and where it was. Okay? So the research portion is your explore portion. This is where you are finding out the meat of your research and your data and all of your questions. You're finding answers, okay? So once you're done finding answers in your research, we'll move on to construct theories. So in this case, we would think of it kind of like a rough draft. So this is where we start creating our idea. So if it were me, I would say, well, I found this mummy and it tells me this and this and this about this culture. So you kind of start creating a rough idea of what you're going to write about to solve your scenario, which is up here. Okay? So you're constructing your theory. What do you think a mummy can tell you about ancient Egyptian culture? That's the question that you need to answer at that point. So from there, when you submit, you'll just be submitting your little rough draft that you made. It can be about a paragraph long of the theory that you came up with. And then all you have to do is move on to test theories. So test theories is where you go back and you kind of revise and edit the information that you have already come up with under test theories. You look at your theory and think about it and think, does this make sense? Is there something that I need to change? Can I add to this? Can I take something out? So for instance, if one of my theories was that people made mummies because they just really like to wrap stuff up in bandages, that probably would not be the best theory to have. And during the test theories part, I would think about it, probably find some information that kind of disproves my theory, and I would edit it out. So when you submit for test theories, I would like you to submit anything that you've changed, any thinking that you've done, any extra research, anything that you've done to revise and edit your theories. After that, you can move on to draw conclusions. So this is kind of like the final draft. So once you've gone through the process, you kind of have an idea of what your final product's going to be. So by this time, I know that I found a mummy and I found all this other great stuff in the pyramid with the mummy, and I can tell you why the Egyptian culture made mummies. I can tell you why they also put all these other artifacts in the pyramid with the mummy, and etc., etc. By this time, you should have your final idea of what you're doing to solve your scenario. Okay? So you submit for draw conclusions, kind of like your final draft. So if you're typing it out, it'll be a paragraph or so long, maybe 2, 3, about what you've learned, how you're solving the scenario, and what your theories are in a final draft form. So you submit that onto It's Learning and move on to create. Now for create, it can be anything that displays your learning. So you can create a PowerPoint, you could create a documentary, you could create a performance, a model, anything that you can share to the class that demonstrates what you've learned. If you make something like a model, I'm going to want some sort of summary paper explaining what you've learned and what your model is, that kind of thing. If you create a presentation, I want you to answer the scenario in your presentation. Tell me what you came up with, what you found out about your culture, how this artifact told you about your culture. So in your presentation, it can be, you can use Prezi, PowerPoint, anything. If you need help coming up with a way to create something, you can always come to me or to Miss Ross. She's really good with coming up with ways to present stuff using technology. So if you want to take the technology route, she's a good person to ask. So this is kind of a summary of how I want the inquiry process to work over this year that you're going to be with me. Every time the scenario will change, but these steps are going to work in the same way for history, okay? So next time we're going to have a different scenario, but we're going to do all of this in a similar way. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me a message on It's Learning or find me during class.